Today I'm going to be talking about work that Ken Kurtz and I have done together exploring analogical transfer from a categorization-based perspective. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with analogical transfer, which refers to our ability to apply knowledge, whether it be knowledge about a specific instance or some abstract principle, to explain, make inferences, or solve a problem in a different content domain. So for example, I'm pretty naive about making a financial investment. So if I'm faced with some decision about how to invest money, as I don't have any relevant domain knowledge, I may instead invoke knowledge from some other relevant domain like natural selection and transfer the principles of natural selection to decide to invest in a mutual fund over a single company, as the mutual fund has greater trait variability, making it more robust to changes in economic selective pressures. And as many of you are likely aware, analogical transfer is often difficult to achieve. So in today's talk, we're going to explore analogical transfer by adopting a categorization-based perspective. And we're working towards this goal of better understanding transfer for both basic and applied implications. With respect to basic implications, transfer is related to many other cognitive phenomena, such as analogy writ large, categorization, stimulus generalization, retrieval processes, creativity, explanation, and problem solving, to name a few. So by better understanding transfer, we might also help better understand some of those related phenomena. There are also applied implications to understanding transfer, as a key goal of educators is to develop pedagogy to promote transferable knowledge. So by better understanding how transfer works, we can suggest improved instructional approaches. Today, we're going to start off by providing a brief review of the current explanation of transfer, then provide an overview of our categorization-inspired approach, along with some supporting evidence, and wrap up by talking about some new data from our most recent project. While the issue of transfer dates back to at least Thorndike or earlier, the modern approach to transfer stems from a seminal series of studies by Chick and Holyoke in 1980. In one of their most famous experiments, they had participants first study a base passage about a general that demonstrated the target principle of convergence, where a large force is divided into smaller forces that are simultaneously applied from multiple angles around a central target to overcome it. After participants studied this passage, they were then given a problem to solve, the famous Dunker's tumor problem, and the critical question was whether participants would use the convergence principle that was demonstrated by this base passage when solving the target problem. Chick and Holyoke found that when participants were given a hint that the base was relevant to the target problem, a majority of participants were able to transfer the convergence principle to solve the problem. In the absence of such a hint, only a few participants were able to spontaneously form an analogy with the passage about the general and transfer the solution. This pattern of results suggests an inert knowledge problem in transfer. Successful hint-aided performance demonstrates that participants have relevant knowledge encoded into memory and can apply it to other domains, while the lack of spontaneous transfer demonstrates a failure in memory access. The inert knowledge problem stems from a paradox of similarity-based retrieval. While structural similarity, or a common underlying principle, is necessary for analogical transfer to occur, superficial similarity ends up being a key determinant in what gets retrieved from memory. So this means that when we're trying to solve a problem like Dunker's tumor problem, we're often going to retrieve information from the same or similar domains. So we might retrieve knowledge of medical procedures, our experiences that we've had with medical professionals, and maybe television shows that take place in a medical setting, and so on, and not from superficially dissimilar domains that might be more relevant to actually solving the problem in a good way. So with the paradox of similarity-based retrieval in mind, to understand how successful spontaneous transfer occurs, we must first understand how to encourage retrieval on the basis of shared meaning, as opposed to shared appearance. And another seminal set of experiments from Chick and Holyoke in 1983 demonstrated that having participants compare two analogs at the time of study leads to improved spontaneous transfer relative to comparison of a single analog and an unrelated case, and subsequent work has demonstrated an advantage of comparison over two analogs that are sequentially presented. And comparison encourages structure-based retrieval because it engages a structural alignment process that highlights commonalities between the analogs and promotes the formation of an abstract schema by filtering out surface-level mismatches. These abstract schemas are more accessible in memory than representations of individual cases because they don't have a surface-level mismatch with the retrieval cues that are provided by the problem that needs to be solved. And since this initial finding from Chick and Holyoke in 1983, comparison has been seen as one of the most effective, if not the most effective, ways to encourage spontaneous transfer. Despite comparison being seen as one of the gold standards for encouraging spontaneous transfer for going on 40 years now, there are multiple shortcomings with its account. First, best case scenario is that after engaging in comparison, only around 50% of participants or less end up demonstrating evidence of successful transfer. And there are many notable experiments in the literature which suggest that the effectiveness of comparison is much less than this 50% rate if comparison shows a benefit over controls at all. Second, the hypothesized retrieval mechanisms for comparison-based encoding are generally passive and inefficient. For example, in the many are called few are chosen model, a superficial filter is applied to all known cases and schemas in memory to filter out any mismatches with the retrieval queue, and then structural evaluation occurs for the remaining cases and schemas to determine what actually gets retrieved from memory. And third, if spontaneous transfer only requires abstract representations, then providing direct instruction of the abstract principle should be sufficient to encourage successful transfer. However, work by Ross and Kilbane has demonstrated that this is not a very effective way to encourage transfer, which raises the question of whether abstraction can offer more than just filtering out idiosyncratic information to create some easy-to-access relational schema. So these shortcomings of a comparison-based account of transfer, coupled with the notion that relational categories are just collective analogies, led to Kurtz and Honke adopting a categorization-based view of analogical transfer reflected in the category status hypothesis. The motivation of this hypothesis is to try and achieve the ease and fluidity that we have with entity or attribute-based categories in analogical transfer. So for example, if we walk into some conference room that we've never been in before, filled with objects that we've never encountered before, we have no trouble at all in categorizing one of these objects as a chair and knowing that we should sit down in it. And this ability to readily categorize and bring to bear our knowledge of entity categories like chair stands in stark contrast to the difficulty of spontaneous transfer, despite both situations involving generalization of conceptual knowledge to novel instances. So we ask whether encoding a relational principle like convergence as a psychological category can make spontaneous transfer more likely to occur in a way similar to the ease that we have in generalizing our conceptual knowledge to a novel chair. This notion is reflected in the category status hypothesis, which states to the extent that the form of a knowledge representation is more category-like, the knowledge will be easier to access under the critical conditions of a high structural match and low superficial match. So how do we form category-like representations of knowledge that are more accessible in memory? To guide our work, we have borrowed constructs from the categorization literature through our facets of categorical knowledge representations. When these facets are sufficiently fostered through some study task, they can result in a target principle attaining the status of a known category or achieving category status. The first facet is category intention or generic category level knowledge. This may be similar to an abstract schema formed during a task-like comparison, but goes beyond representing relational structure independent of the concrete details of an analog. It also involves explicitly treating an abstract schema as a concept or a tool of thought. While comparison of two analogs is one way to support category intention, other tasks such as direct instruction of a target principle, classification, and generating a new analog can also provide support for this facet. Another facet is category extension, which involves knowledge of the range of concrete cases that are associated with category membership and how to differentiate between members of a category and non-members. The focus on knowledge about individual cases is related to Brian Ross's reminding view, but goes beyond this account by highlighting the importance of explicitly relating those cases with category knowledge. And the final facet is bidirectional type token mapping between generic category level knowledge and specific study cases. Bidirectional mapping highlights the importance of jointly developing category intention and extension when acquiring a concept. In other words, bidirectional mapping highlights the importance of using experiences with individual study cases to form, refine, or elaborate generic category knowledge, while at the same time using your generic category knowledge to better make sense of or interpret individual study cases. And by sufficiently developing these three facets of category representations, intention, extension, and bidirectional mapping, it can elevate a target principle to the status of a known concept that will be more directly activated in memory and fluidly applied across domains. So we'd like to emphasize that this hypothesis is not intended to invalidate or replace existing accounts of transfer, as most of the previous theoretical points made about transfer are maintained in this hypothesis. Rather, we seek to propose some extensions of these accounts in a few critical areas. For example, relational categories maintain the same relational representational commitments as analogy. Both involve structured representations of cases and abstractions. We seek to extend this by considering how these representations are organized and linked together in memory through categorization. The facets of category representation suggest that it's important for a study task to support participants forming both representations of individual cases, as well as generic knowledge, and that it's important for participants to navigate between both generic knowledge and individual cases when building up a representation or making sense of some new information. The hypothesis also maintains commitments to the existing theoretical accounts of analogical mapping. It views transfer as a process of bringing two structured representations into alignment and projecting structure from the base to fill in missing structure or devise a solution to the target problem. And with respect to how knowledge is accessed, the hypothesis extends existing accounts by proposing that an initial structure-based memory search first occurs over known categories that allows for direct access and retrieval of knowledge representations through a categorization mechanism. If this initial category-based search fails to produce relevant knowledge, then the hypothesis predicts that access occurs through the established mechanisms by existing accounts. So we know that we've covered a lot of information about this hypothesis very quickly, so I just want to briefly recap some of the key points and commitments of it before we get into the actual experiments. So in contrast to comparison-based schema formation, the core commitment of the category status hypothesis is that it's important to form abstractions that signify some kind of meaning in the world, and to establish type token relationships between generic category level knowledge and instances of a category. In other words, abstractions are linked to concrete cases and are actively used to make sense of our experiences. Under the category status hypothesis, the main goal of encoding tasks is to acquire and establish an abstract principle as a stable relational concept and encountered analogs as instances of that concept, as opposed to just encoding cases and schemas into memory and storing them there. By sufficiently achieving this goal through using study tasks that adequately engage the facets of category representations, it leads to a target principle achieving the status of a known category. And the final element of this hypothesis is that when we encounter a problem to solve, we first attempt to classify it with respect to our known categories. This provides a reduced search space for retrieval. If we have successfully encoded a target principle as a relational category, we can then access it from this reduced search space through categorization, as opposed to the passive search over what Jeff Lowenstein has called the ocean of possibilities for analogical retrieval when all known cases and schemas are considered. So in a paper that Ken and I have recently published in JAP-LMC, we have operationalized encouraging category status as encouraging participants to view a target principle as a relational category at the time of study. As a conservative test of this hypothesis, we created a task that provides very weak support for comparison-based schema development, but does provide strong support for developing a categorical representation, and evaluated this novel task against comparison. So the task that we created, we called the category building task, and we based it on sequential summarization of cases, as sequential summarization is a common control for comparison that provides the same case exposure, but does not do a good job of encouraging schema abstraction. We then added categorical encoding supports to this summarization-based task to encourage participants to view the target principle as a relational category. So in the category building task, participants started off by receiving instructions that described what categories are and how they're used, and told participants that their upcoming task involved learning about a set of new categories. Participants were then sequentially presented with 4 cases that each demonstrated the same target principle. Each one of these cases was labeled as a member of the category, and participants were prompted to summarize what aspects of each case they thought made it belong to the category they were learning about. After participants completed this task for the 4th case, we then asked them to provide an explanation of the category that had been learned. So participants were randomly assigned to this category building task to encourage category status, a single comparison task to encourage schema abstraction, or a double comparison task, which is basically the same thing as single comparison, but repeated twice for 2 new cases to encourage schema abstraction while controlling for case exposure in the category building. Participants engaged in these tasks to acquire 2 different relational principles through exposure to cases. This involved the convergent stimulus set of the chicken Holyoke experiments and the problem as a solution stimulus set that was created by Garrett Honke. The most pertinent experiment in our paper involves a spontaneous reminding assessment, which does not require participants to apply knowledge to some new domain as the problem-solving task of chicken Holyoke does, and focuses more on the critical prediction of the category status hypothesis that concerns the access process underlying successful transfer. So after participants completed their respective study task, They were told that they were moving on to a new experiment and received the spontaneous reminding assessment. In this task, participants were sequentially presented with superficially dissimilar cases that demonstrated one of the two target principles from the study phase, intermixed with distractor cases. Participants were asked to write down what each case reminded them of or what it made them think of, and we operationalized structure-based retrieval as whether they included a description of the principle from the study phases or the cases encountered during the study phases and their response to each case. So here are the results from the category building experiment, where we're showing the proportion of trials in which participants experienced the successful structure-based reminding on the y-axis and condition on the x-axis. Looking first at this overall panel, we found that the category building task led to a significantly higher rate of structure-based retrieval than both double comparison and single comparison. And we see the same pattern of result when looking at the results broken down by each of the two stimulus sets that we included in the experiment. And just a reminder that previous work has said that comparison is one of the most effective ways to encourage schema abstraction and spontaneous transfer by making superficially dissimilar knowledge more accessible in memory. And here we're seeing a very large improvement in access in the category building condition relative to both comparison tasks. And across other experiments in this paper, we also found increased spontaneous transfer in the category building task relative to single comparison when using the problem-solving measure of Jick and Holyoake, suggesting that our results aren't just an artifact of the particular reminding procedure that we used. We found an advantage of category building over a summarization task that did not include any categorization supports, which demonstrates that summarization does not just become an effective way to encode a relational principle when the number of study cases is increased. And we also provided evidence that any single one of our categorization supports, the enhanced category-focused instructions, the provision of category labels, or having participants explain the category that they were learning, was sufficient to produce the full benefit of the category building task that included all three of these different supports. So taken together, we feel that these results demonstrate that encouraging participants to construe a relational principle as a psychological category through a task like category building leads to improved structure-based retrieval of superficially dissimilar prior knowledge. And we also see convergent evidence coming from experiments that explore category construction tasks. So for example, Kurtz and Honke had participants acquire a relational principle through either comparison or a sorting task where participants were shown 6 cases, 3 of which demonstrated the target principle and 3 of which did not, and were asked to sort them into 2 equally sized categories based on the way that they felt was most natural. And across multiple experiments, Kurtz and Honke demonstrated an advantage of participants transferring knowledge better in the category construction condition relative to comparison. We also have evidence from a separate series of experiments in an applied domain that students who used category constructions as a review activity in 7th grade life science classes demonstrated transfer benefits over students who reviewed the same content through a worksheet that fostered comprehension of the same cases and support for encoding those cases and target principles into memory. So taken together, the results of the category building and category construction experiments provide what we feel is strong support for the category status hypothesis as a novel pathway to successful transfer. However, an outstanding question is what makes thinking of a principle as a category lead to such benefits? So in the present study, instead of operationalizing category status at the category level, as was done in category building and category construction tasks, we chose to operationalize it at the level of the different facets of categorical knowledge: intention, extension, and mapping. The central goal here is to demonstrate that each facet plays a role in transfer success, and an exploratory goal is to understand how providing support for each one of these facets might relate to both access and application components of transfer. So to this end, we are working on elaborating our description of the different facets of category representations by identifying various pathways via the type, token, type to token, and token to type that provide a more detailed and clearer way for how you can engage or invoke each one of these facets of categorical knowledge. So category extension involves tasks that support knowledge of individual cases and using experiences with those cases to form abstractions. Category extension can be supported via a token pathway, which provides a greater support for developing knowledge of the range of concrete cases that are associated with category membership. And it can also be supported via the token to type pathway that highlights the influence of using experiences with individual study cases through a task like classification or comparison to support induction of the underlying structural similarities. Category intension involves tasks that provide support for generic category knowledge. This can be supported via the type pathway, which directly supports the development or refinement of generic knowledge through tasks like direct instruction of an abstract principle and self-explanation of a known category. The type pathway can also be indirectly influenced by the output of the token to type pathway in the category extension facet. So for example, a task like comparison better engages the token to type pathway than a task like sequential summarization, which results in it making a stronger contribution to generic knowledge. Another way to support category intention is through the type to token pathway, which involves using generic knowledge to make sense of new experiences. So for example, a task like having participants generate new example analogs based on categorical knowledge that they have. And finally, bidirectional mapping does not introduce any novel pathways. It consists of the token to type and type to token pathways of the other facets. But you can think of bidirectional mapping as highlighting the importance of a positive feedback loop that occurs during learning, whereas a task engages one pathway, it also provides support for the other. So to make this idea clear, consider a task like classification training in the categorization literature. During initial trials of classification, participants are primarily inducing an underlying structure based off of experiences with the examples that they encounter or by using the token to type pathway. As participants develop some knowledge of the underlying category structure, it can then be leveraged to support improved interpretation of cases via the type to token pathway. And these improved interpretation of cases lead to improved in classification decisions, which in turn better refine generic knowledge. And you can get the sense that this is sort of snowballing into a positive feedback loop, whereas you get better category knowledge, you can make better interpretations of cases. And as you make better interpretations of cases, you can get improved or better refined generic knowledge. So in the present study, we use these different pathways to facets of category knowledge to select a number of individual study tasks that when combined into a single condition, provide strong support for a given facet of categorical knowledge. So all conditions started off with a baseline comparison task, and per existing theoretical accounts, this should be sufficient to induce an abstract schema and achieve a high level of transfer success. In contrast, the category status hypothesis predicts that comparison supports the token to type pathway and thus can be made more effective when it's combined with tasks that provide further support for different facets of categorical knowledge. So in each one of our experimental conditions, we added 2 additional tasks after comparison to provide support for a specific facet. So in the intention condition, participants started off with comparison of 2 cases. They then were shown an abstract statement of the target principle and were asked to paraphrase it to provide support for the type pathway or generic knowledge, and ended the task by being asked to generate a new analog along with some support that we gave them to provide support for the type to token pathway or using their generic knowledge to make sense of or structure a new experience. In the extension condition, a sequential presentation of 2 additional cases provided support for the token pathway or increased case exposure, and participants were asked to classify each one of those 2 cases and write an explanation of their classification decision to provide support for the token to type pathway, which involves using their experiences with cases to refine generic category knowledge. In the mapping condition, after they completed the comparison task, they were asked to classify a contrast case to provide support for the token to type pathway, similar to the extension condition. And after they had completed that task, they were told the contrast case did not demonstrate the target principle and were asked to rewrite it so that it was a positive example of the target principle to provide support for the type to token pathway, similar to the generate task in the intention condition. And the basic logic of this design is that if any of our experimental conditions lead to a transfer improvement over the baseline condition, it would implicate the respective facet of category knowledge as being important to successful transfer. So participants were randomly assigned to one of our 4 study conditions to acquire the convergence principle from Chick and Holyoke through exposure to cases. After they completed their respective study task, participants were told they were starting a new experiment and given the tumor problem to solve. Transfer was operationalized as using the solution from the study phase to solve the tumor problem. The first time participants received the problem, it was administered under the guise of a new experiment. So for transfer to occur here, participants had to spontaneously access the target principle from memory and then apply it to the tumor problem. After participants completed the spontaneous transfer assessment, they then proceeded to the hint-aided transfer assessment, where they were given a second chance to solve the problem, but this time we're told to try and think about the category they had learned in the study phase when coming up with a solution. And by providing a hint, we can attenuate the access demands during hint-aided transfer so that it primarily serves as a measure of participants' ability to apply the target principle. So here are the results from our spontaneous transfer assessment. Here we see that participants in the intention condition, which tried to support generic categorizing knowledge, and participants in the extension condition, which tried to support better knowledge of the range of cases associated with category membership, both led to a significantly higher rate of spontaneous transfer than the baseline comparison tasks. This suggests that both dimensions, intention and extension of categorical knowledge, are related to successful transfer. I'd also like to briefly highlight that we're seeing about a 20% improvement in the intention condition relative to the baseline comparison task, which has historically been seen as one of the most effective ways to encourage spontaneous transfer. So this suggests that our intention task has the potential to be a very high impact way to encourage transfer. And finally, we failed to find any differences between our mapping condition, which consisted of trying to support using generic knowledge to make sense of cases and using cases to help refine generic knowledge relative to the baseline comparison task. Looking next at our hint-aided transfer assessment, we found that only the intention condition led to a significantly higher rate of hint-aided transfer than baseline, suggesting that it supports the ability to apply the target principle to new domains. We found no significant difference between the extension condition and baseline, but I'd like to highlight a non-significant trend of 0.06. And we found no significant difference between mapping and baseline conditions. Given that we had both significant and numerical differences between conditions on the hint-aided assessment, it makes it difficult to interpret what differences on our spontaneous transfer assessment mean. They could be only attributable to differences in application between condition, or they could be the result of both access and application differences between conditions. So we address this by reanalyzing all of our spontaneous transfer data for only the subset of participants that were successfully able to apply the principle on the hint-aided assessment. So within this subset of hint-aided successes, any differences between conditions would reflect some contribution of accessibility of prior knowledge, as all participants could apply the principle. So within this restricted sample, we see that the intention condition led to a significantly higher rate of transfer than the baseline condition, which suggests that it not only improves the ability to apply the principle, but also the ability to access it. We found no significant differences between the extension and mapping conditions and baseline. So in the present experiment, we found that the intention condition led to improvements over baseline for both spontaneous and hint-aided transfer measures. This suggests that providing support for category intention at the time of encoding had a positive effect on the ability to access germane, yet superficially dissimilar prior knowledge, and also the ability to apply knowledge to another domain. We found that the extension condition led to improvements over baseline on the spontaneous transfer assessment, but failed to find a significant difference on the hint-aided transfer assessment or the reanalysis of spontaneous transfer data for the restricted sample. So this suggests that providing support for category extension at the time of encoding does have a positive impact on transfer success, but we're unable to partition this benefit into how extension relates to improved access and application. And given the success of both of these conditions over the gold standard of analogical comparison, we might ask whether we're positioned to make a contribution to the applied goal of creating instructional techniques that effectively foster transfer. However, it's worth noting that in the present study, our goal was to create tasks to explore individual facets of categorical representations, and the category status hypothesis predicts that a maximally effective task would engage all three facets. So in ongoing experiments, we're starting to explore how tasks that sort of stack these different facets together into a single study condition relates to transfer success, to achieving a guideline for how to create instructional interventions that encourage transfer. The effect of the intention condition over comparison is notable in that previous work suggests that the individual supporting tasks alone, paraphrasing a target principle and generation of an analog, should not produce very large transfer benefits themselves. However, some combination of these tasks suggested by the category status hypothesis does seem to produce a study task that is effective in supporting transfer success. So in some of the ongoing experiments we're currently running in the lab, we're working to understand what's making the intention condition effective in encouraging transfer. We also found that the extension condition led to transfer benefits, but were unable to reduce it into how it relates to both access of prior knowledge and application to other domains. So in future work, we wish to explore some factors that may moderate the effectiveness of the extension condition. As prior work has demonstrated that superficially dissimilar study cases lead to improved access of prior knowledge, we may wish to consider manipulating the surface similarity of the study cases that are included in the extension condition. And this idea is congruent with manipulating exposure to the range of category membership that participants experience, with the prediction being that if they experience a wider set of superficial characteristics or a wider range of category membership, it might sort of boost performance in the extension condition. Prior research has also shown that encouraging participants to be reminded of analogous items at the time of study leads to improved accessibility of prior knowledge. And as a major theme in the category status hypothesis is encouraging participants to be reminded of their categorical knowledge when interacting with some relevant case, if we tried to frame the classification tasks in such a way that it encouraged participants to be reminded of the category, it may also improve the effectiveness of the extension task itself. And when we were talking about these results in the lab, the benefit of both intension and extension conditions over comparison, we found it very hard to come up with one single explanation that could explain both results without invoking category status or something very similar to it. But during the question and answer session, we appreciate any ideas that you have on alternative explanations we may have overlooked. And lastly, we failed to find any evidence that providing support for bidirectional mapping was related to transfer success. And this is our current interpretation of the data, that providing support for bidirectional type token mapping doesn't seem to be related to transfer. Looking on the bright side of ANOL results, however, at least finding that mapping didn't differ from baseline comparison demonstrates that simply having participants complete more tasks doesn't necessarily lead to transfer improvements. So in the intention and extension condition, it doesn't seem like those benefits are being driven by simply having more tasks to do. Rather, it seems like they're getting the right kind of tasks to complete. It's also worth noting that in our attempts to create a design that controlled for the number of tasks and opportunities to interact with the target principal between our experimental conditions, the bidirectional mapping condition was probably the one with the weakest operationalization of a facet of category status. So participants in this task only had one complete experience in bidirectional mapping in the entire experiment. And if we think about a task like classification learning that inspired this construct, typically you engage in multiple or many experiences in bidirectional mapping throughout a task. So it's possible that multiple experiences in bidirectional mapping, so maybe doing something like this multiple times over many different cases, might be required to see an effect of bidirectional mapping. It's also worth noting that our translation of type to token and token to type pathways into task elements for this condition differed from how they were translated for the intention and extension conditions. So we used a contrast case instead of a positive one like we did in the extension condition, and we used a contrast case that was easy for participants to classify and fix in the mapping condition, even though a study by Jick and Patterson suggests that might not be the most effective kind of contrast case to use if we're trying to support transfer. So in future work, we wish to explore whether it's possible to observe a benefit of the mapping condition if we try to set the task up in a way where it provides multiple experiences in bidirectional mapping and or better translations of the type to token and token to type pathways into task elements. So overall, the results provide support for the category status hypothesis and suggest that by providing supports for specific facets of category status, specifically category intention and extension, but not mapping, are associated with transfer improvements over a baseline comparison task. And this result suggests that some of the benefits that we've seen in previous work, like the category building and category construction tasks, might result from those tasks supporting the development of intentional and extensional knowledge especially well. And more broadly, these results suggest that successful transfer requires more than just schema abstraction. They suggest that transfer involves reinforcing the principle as a kind of thing or invoking intentional knowledge and understanding how it relates to or can be instantiated in multiple contexts or encouraging extensional knowledge. So that's all that I had today. Thank you all for tuning in and paying attention, and I'd be more than happy to shift over to questions at this point.